Everyone for joining this session today. I'm Jonathan Pickering. I'm based at the University of Canberra, and I'm a co-chair of the Scientific Steering Committee of the Earth System Governance Project. And as is traditional, and here I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land which I'm speaking today, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and to pay my respects to their elders past and present, and to extend that respect to all First Nations people who are here today. So it's been a big week for the ESG network. We've had something like over 1,200 registered participants at the forum and almost 50 sessions. And it's been great to see so many people come together in the forum, both those who've been part of the network for a long time. Really good to see some familiar faces, but also great to meet many people who are new to the network. And we've had an excellent range of panels, some fascinating and often robust discussions. And this closing plenary is really an opportunity to round out the forum by bringing some of the threads of these discussions together, particularly around the forum's overall theme of reimagining Earth system governance in an era of polycrisis. So just very briefly about how the session will run. In a moment, I'll hand over to my colleague Chuks Okereke, who will moderate a panel of experts I'm very excited to hear about. And then towards the end of the plenary, we'll wrap up with a few concluding reflections from me, and then I'll give a vote of thanks. So with no further ado, I'd like to introduce our moderator for our panel today, our wonderful colleague Chuks Okereke. So Chuks is Professor of Global Governance and Public Policy at the School of Policy Studies at University of Bristol. He's also the Director of the Centre for Climate Change and Development at Alex Ekwueme Federal University, Nufu-Alike, and a visiting professor at the London School of Economics and Political Science. His expertise is on global climate governance and international development, with an emphasis on climate justice and national green growth, transition in Africa. He's also been strongly involved in the work of the IPCC and advisor on Nigeria's climate policy. He's also a fellow member of the Scientific Steering Committee of the ESG project, and very importantly, too, a member of the organising team for the forum. So has played a vital role in envisioning this event and bringing it to fruition. So Chuks will introduce our panel members and facilitate the discussion. So over to you, Chuks.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Thank you, colleagues, for coming to this closing plenary. In this last week, we have occupied ourselves trying to understand the nature of the polycrisis that we are facing globally. We have talked about the fact that we are witnessing accelerating and amplifying global risks due to increased human consumption, pollution, and connectivity between systems. We've talked about the fact that these risks are becoming more synchronized and potentially resulting in scenarios that could pose existential threat to humanity. We've talked about the fact that we have a positive, we seem to have a positive feedback loops that are contributing to the acceleration and amplification of these systemic risks. But at the same time, that governance has been fragmented due to traditional bifurcations and silos, leading to ineffective response. We've talked about the need for greater anticipation and imagination in order to be able to combat this. And so it is with great pleasure that I want to introduce some of my good friends and colleagues with whom I will discuss some of these issues in greater depth and pull together some of the threads, as Jonathan said, that have crisscrossed this one-week conference. I see Blake has also posted a chart. I will give them, each of them, about 7 to 8 minutes to lay down their initial thoughts. We will go through some ping pong session where I'll ask some general questions and specific questions. But after that, you will have opportunity to also ask your questions. So you could at any point post your questions in the Q&A, but also you have the opportunity, also the option of raising your hand, and Blake will allow you to voice your question or contribution. So here are my panelists. David Hoyer, a computational historian and complexity scientist. He holds a PhD in classics from New York University, where he studied economic and social development in the High Roman Empire. Since 2014, David has been part of SESHAT, a global history databank, a multidisciplinary project examining long-run social dynamics by combining qualitative and empirical information about the past with advanced quantitative analysis and computational modeling. He has affiliations with the Complexity Science Hub, Vienna, and Social AI Lab at the University of Toronto, where I think he's joining us from today. And he has just founded a new organization, SODI. SODI, a historical policy lab, and his research explores societal responses to shifting ecological, social, and economic contexts that generate crisis and shape the well-being experienced by different communities. And he has recently published a paper that explores how we could manage polycrisis from a social-cultural perspective. We also have distinguished Professor Laura Pereira, who's a professor in sustainability transformation and futures at the Global Change Institute at the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa, leading a number of projects, including as the co-I of the Future Ecosystems for Africa program. Laura is also a researcher at the Stockholm Resilience Center, where she's involved in work on sustainability transformations and futures. She's interested in the interface between traditional knowledge and innovation, the role of futures, techniques in transformative change, and developing innovative methods for knowledge co-production in developing country context. Laura's work uses the full system to unpack and unpick broader challenges and solutions to complexity of governance, the governance of sustainability transformations. Laura is an Earth Commissioner herself, an expert on the IPBES task force on scenarios and models, and she maintains an extraordinary appointment at the Center for Complex Systems in Transition at Stellenbosch University. Oh, and by the way, Laura is also heavily involved as an executive committee that is leading the organization of the 2025 Transformation Community ESG conference that is coming out in South Africa. She will have the opportunity to tell us more about that in a moment. And we have Thomas Haselböck, a social entrepreneur, community weaver, and strategic doer. I quite like that. He joined the Transformations Community in 2022 as the conference manager for the TC23 conference and currently serves as operations lead. With over a decade of experience in event organizations, project development, and community building, he has been involved in several initiatives and networks within the social impact space. Tom maintains interest in inner transformation, regenerative communities, and innovative ecosystems. Tom is currently based in Spain. So welcome, distinguished panelists. I have suggested that you spend your first 7 to 8 minutes to share your initial thoughts on the concept of polycrisis, Earth systems governance, transformation, sustainability, and potentially equity. And we're going to go with Daniel first, and after that, Laura, and then Thomas. Daniel, over to you.
Okay, turn on my volume there. Excellent. Thank you so much, Chuks, for the invitation and the kind introduction. Thrilled to be here. This is really fantastic. This is a sort of new venue for me, but really excited to get into this space and learn from all of you about the prospects for transforming and rethinking, reimagining. I like the idea of imagination there, reimagining how we approach these issues. As Chuks mentioned, I'm an historian, sort of by training, turned into a complexity scientist, for whatever that means. And really in my work with colleagues, we're sort of looking back to look forward, seeing what history can teach us, how it can guide us for good and for bad, the positive and the negative lessons from the past to help us sort of understand and navigate where we are in the present and where we might be headed in the future. And this includes looking at what I would call polycrisis-like periods in the past. There's certainly a lot of novel and unique things about our present troubles, but there's also a lot of similarities. A lot of things have been experienced by humans before, and I think there's a lot of valuable lessons to be learned there. When we sort of survey these past historical experiences, one of the things that jumps out kind of immediately is inequality is at the root of so much of it. Material inequality, what we would call structural inequality, disparities in access to power, to wealth, to prestige, to just be included in decision makings, to just have the ability to pursue and attain sort of the good life. Inequality has really been one of history's great monsters. This is something that sort of jumped out in all of my work looking at the past. This isn't surprising. No one's going to be completely shocked that inequality sort of leads to all of these sorts of issues in terms of capacity decline, loss of social cohesion, all sorts of horrible things that can spiral and build on themselves, turn into these vicious cycles, as Chuks was mentioning. I think what the historical perspective does show that maybe is a little bit surprising or maybe underappreciated is just how deep the structural pressures are, that the deep roots of these inequalities run a lot deeper than many of us expect. They take decades, generations to build up, feed on each other, interact, turn into these kind of polycrisis-like environments as they're just at the core of so much of these interactions. What this means and sort of the insight that one of the insights that we can gain from this, I think, is that our solutions need to be just as deep, just as structural, and just as long-term, right? We're talking about interventions that will take decades, generations to unwind all of the pressures that have been building up over that same time period without getting derailed. And this is where I think the real challenge comes in, right? That real adaptive, positive transformation is going to require several rounds of reform. It's not a thing we can do. It's things we need to do to build on each other for years and years and years, starting immediately, starting before now, but to keep it going. I think, for example, of sort of the New Deal policies in the US in the mid to late 1930s, yes, they were a response to sort of the Depression and the shock of that, but in many ways, they were also a continuation and expansion of policies that were put in place decades earlier in response to the late 19th century inequalities and sort of frustrations and violence that was going on in the country before then. And it was only the interaction, that sort of long-term building on policies one after another for a long time period that you started to see something looking like it was headed towards sort of progress, improvement, and well-being and these sorts of things. This is a problem for us as we can't guarantee that we're going to have time to implement and especially reinforce all of these good policies, all of these good interventions that we need to. So we need strategies that need to address the immediate needs, absolutely, but are also sensitive and responsive to the deep structural causes, and then are adaptable and robust to the multiple potential futures that we have, knowing that things are going to keep happening, that there's derailment risks are real, as my friend Laurie Layburn talks about. So this is sort of where I'm coming from and how I sort of view the polycrisis, that this longer temporal sort of scope and the importance and significance of that. One of the things I've been working with colleagues trying to unpack, and I was just at a conference the other day about sort of cultural evolution and how this kind of framework can maybe help us crafting these types of solutions that are up to the task. And what this sort of suggests is that we need, not any prepackaged one-size-fits-all kinds of solutions to come in and say, okay, here's what we need to do, put it in place, and then, watch it sort of unfurl. But really what we're trying to do is expose the complexity, expose the deep structural roots of the issues at stake, and open spaces for communication, sharing of ideas, set the target of our sort of selection force on things like inclusive well-being rather than economic growth or military security or some of these forces that have dominated discussions in the past, and then let the marketplace of ideas kind of sort out winning strategies for each different context and let them be more adaptable as those contexts are going to shift, because they are going to shift. Thinking about things like citizens' assemblies, facilitated expert deliberations, these potentially scalable kinds of policies, these are there, these have proven to be effective, at least on a smaller scale, at this kind of flexible, resilient adaptations. So there are things there are models of building the kind of cooperation and coordination we need that are out there that can maybe reimagine, rethink, restructure the way that we work in our communities, in our nations, and internationally. We just sort of need the imagination and the openness to really see them and put them into place. And I'm very, very excited to sort of be here and hear from all of you and learn where we can start to identify and put these things into practice. So thank you so much for being here and for listening.
Thank you, Daniel. Excellent point. When we would have heard from Laura and Tom, I'm going to come back to you, but let me prepare you some questions so that you can have time to think. So you are highlighting, collaboration, deliberative democracy, citizen assembly, open spaces for idea as important ways to come up with some ideas to begin to affect some of the reforms that are required. But you said in your recent article, you highlighted the importance of elite competition as a major factor, a social-cultural factor. So how can we overcome this competition for resources, for power, in order to build this deliberative democracy collaboration that you've said is important? Second question, and Laura may pick up on that. You say that inequality, deep structural inequality leads to several of these things that are exacerbating the polycrisis. Some people say that the pursuit of equality is one of the reasons why we have the polycrisis, that we should just get away with thinking about justice and equity so that we can focus on effectiveness. How will you respond to that? So you pack those questions, and I'll go to Laura.
Cool. Thanks, Chuks. Thanks, Daniel. Good to see you all. Sure, just a minor topic, right? Polycrisis in the end of the scene. How to save the world with governance, reimagining it. But I think, Daniel touched on this really important aspect of inequality, of sort of historical lock-ins, right, that have actually kind of landed up in this place. And I think a lot of the work that we've been trying to do from the transformation side is understand, well, what are those deliberate systemic reconfigurations that we can try to put in place to bring us out of these historical lock-ins, right? Sort of thinking through similar kinds of dynamics, relationships and configurations, but then also understanding that there's a plurality of these factors, right, in terms of what we think of as preferable, in terms of the trade-offs that we have between different kinds of systems. I mean, we're looking at consumption. I mean, Chuks, you were also with us on Earth Commission when we were thinking through, this idea of a safe and just space, right? Sort of safe to sort of sit within the biophysical limits of the planet, but also just meaning sort of equitable access to the needs, the goods, the resources that we have. And quite often getting there is not just about bringing people up to meet those needs, but it's about bringing some people down, right? Because we're looking at overconsumption, we're looking at inequitable use and access to resources. So, but those are politically hard conversations to start having, right? In terms of who's going to be losing, who's going to be winning. And I think that that's where I'm excited about about this intersection between the Earth System Governance community and the Transformations community coming up into the conference. And I know Thomas will also link into what we're planning to be doing there. But I think that we could have come to this moment where we've seen this critical need for the ways that these communities are thinking about the changes that are required to actually come together, because it's a polycrisis. And on that note, just a side point, it was interesting. I'm an author on the ongoing GO7 report, and we got an email this week from the Secretariat basically saying that we're not allowed to use the term polycrisis, because it's, it's apparently certain government stakeholder groups are, saying this is unacceptable language, blah, 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 so we're even just sitting at that language barrier, right, of sort of not recognizing or not wanting to recognize the fact that these are fundamentally interconnected, interlinked issues and concerns, and that, we need to solve all of them together, not just one of them at a time. And that's scary, right, for governments, for decision makers, for business. But I think it's the mental space we need to be moving into if we're going to start orienting onto these more sustainable, just trajectories that we want to reimagine. So I've been actually at the International Marine Conservation Conference in Cape Town this week. So I was only dabbling in and out of the ESG conference, but I did manage to sit on the Imagination and Anticipations panel discussion that we had earlier on in the week. And I think that was a really great discussion of some of the novel methods that we're sort of pulling together to foreground imagining what it could be if we got things right. What does it look like if we start to unweave all of these sort of structural lock-ins and dependencies that sort of have got into this place and reconfigure them into something that we actually think of as preferable. Understanding that plurality of preference sort of is different to different contexts, times, knowledge systems, etc. And I think that's another critical skill or capacity that this group is also starting to work on building, are sort of really taking out into the real world with people. And I'm very excited just additionally on this connection with the arts and the humanities that we're starting to forge too. I think, it's not just strict natural scientists or social scientists, and now we're interdisciplinary scientists, but also recognizing that there are multiple ways of engaging with the world, and being able to sort of draw on the arts and the humanities, not just as communication devices, but actually as part and parcel of the type of work that needs to get done, talking to emotions, to value systems, to how we inspire change, I think is also a really interesting step. And I think all of these components is something that we really want to bring into the conference next year in South Africa. But I think just with all of that foregrounding, the importance, I think, of being together in place and having real conversations with real people. The online format is fantastic. It's really good for these kinds of connections. And I think that it needs to continue to play an important role on how we convene. But I think also that human connection, that actually being able to sort of sit down with someone to read the non-verbal sort of signals and communications that we all have, we're social beings, is also going to be an important component of bringing these two communities together next year. So those are the high-level thoughts from my side.
Thank you, Laura. I'm already exploring potential tickets for South Africa. So you will have. I will welcome you to even say a bit more about South Africa and what we're trying to do 2025. The question I will have for you, Laura, is it strikes me that you make this point about this organization saying not to use polycrisis. It reminds me of the conversation that we have over and over again when we're writing IPCC reports. Some people say, no. We need to find, positive, upbeat terms to encourage transformation, to encourage change. And other people say, no, we need to tell it as it is. We need to paint a picture of urgency, which may resort to being criticized as being alarmist. So as we look to inspire change and transformation, where would you see kind of what kind of tone should we be striking? Of positivity, we have AI, technology growth, increase in a range of knowledge in various areas. Should we be trying more positive tone, or should we be more, if you like, alarmist to tell it as it is? So, and you talked about our work, that inequality is a big part of this, and then some people have to come down, other people have to come up. So would global degrowth be one thing that you think we should be considering as a part of a core transformative agenda? Please take time to reflect on that. Why I go to Thomas.
Thanks a lot, Chuks, and Laura, Daniel, Jonathan, everybody making this event happen. Yeah, I'm really honored by this invitation. Just to introduce myself briefly, and thanks, Chuks, for introducing me already. I'm the Community and Operations Leader at the Transformations Community, and also the Conference Manager for next year's conference, which I will talk about in a bit. My background is not in academia, it is in social entrepreneurship, in innovation ecosystems, and I have the focus on community building, well-being, mental health. I have a light academic background in international development from the University of Vienna. Yeah, and I'm stepping in today for Bruce Goldstein, our lead weaver at the Transformations Committee, who unfortunately couldn't join today due to time zone constraints. So I'll give my best to represent the Transformations Committee and its spirit. Yeah, and yeah, I'm just sensing what has been shared before by Daniel and Laura, and maybe jumping on that a bit first. I think, Daniel, there's a good point on the historical inequality, the root of the inequality, and the historical systems that we have created, and that there are several rounds of reform and collaboration and deliberative democracy, as you call it, Chuks, needed. And I was interested by the point where you said, let's focus on inclusive well-being over economic growth and let the marketplace sort out the winning strategies. Of course, as a social entrepreneur, this is a very interesting statement here. Also, Laura, I think, yeah, there's a few things on the arts and a different form of communication, almost a trigger of our awareness that leads to a consciousness shift. So I'm really glad to hear that you're emphasizing the arts, which is a big part of next year's conference. And yeah, with that in mind, I'm thinking about the Polycrisis and the reimagination of various lenses. I think from the Transformations Community side, we have 4 T's as principles. We have the transdisciplinarity, we have translocalism, and we have transformative learning and temperance. The temperance is, I'm starting with the last one, the balance between the individual creativity and the collective action. Transformative learning is also about transforming learning systems and knowledge systems, right? Translocalism, how can we solutions that respect local contexts, but also cross-pollinate solutions, and the last one on transdisciplinarity, which is at the core of the identity of the Transformations Community, about crossing boundaries, the silos that you have mentioned, Chuks. Like, how can we foster collaboration and yeah, not only transdisciplinary collaboration, but also collaboration between different sectors and a combined research and action. That's what the core of the Transformations Committee is. We're really excited to host next year's conference jointly with the ESG project, which will be a very exciting journey, bringing these 2 communities together. As like the Earth System Governance Community, we believe in the power of collaboration, of innovation, of inclusivity, and we have a very special place to hold that conference. We will be in the national park in South Africa, in Kruger National Park, and so probably quite an unusual setting for a conference like that, with a few pre- and post-conference activities around that, and bringing these 2 communities together. The submissions are open at the moment, like our call for proposals is open another 6 weeks, I think, until the end of November, and then there might be a second round as well. We have different themes.
Yeah, Thomas,
Sorry,
I have heard that there are innovative sessions that are not quite like presenting papers that as we're used to at ESG. Could you talk a little bit about that? What forms will the sessions take, if you remember now? If not, you can check it out.
No,
I'll come back
definitely.
later.
No, we have two streams basically in this conference. One is more the academic and disciplinary paper presentations, which probably will resonate a lot with the ESG community, because that's that's the more academic side of things. And as you mentioned, Chuks, we also have the innovative side of things. That means like workshops, interactive dialogues. We have pre-conference workshops that we have on the 17th, on the Sunday before. We have 8 workshop slots, and we are still searching for workshop proposals, or we're open to workshop proposals that we can do there. And also our goal is to include practitioners and for knowledge co-production, in the sense that we are crossing the boundaries, crossing the silos, and enable a space where different perspectives are included, respected, and cross-pollinate each other, and where we can inspire each other. And I think that leads us to that reimagination part of the Polycrisis. I think imagination happens with unlearning, but also with different lenses that we can put on. And I think the more diverse backgrounds we have in a room, the more rich is the perspectives we can have on the polycrises, or however you want to call this. So yeah, that's so feel free to check out the session types on the website. I can put in the link in the chat if you give me a minute on that. And yeah, so that's kind of, I think the core identity of the Transformations Committee, to bring together artists, to bring together practitioners, to bring together scientists, to bring people together from the public sector, and have these dialogues together, and share solutions. Yeah. So that's some of my sharing.
Okay, thank you. What about the speed talks? What are they? The speed talks and the T labs. Maybe Laura can take that on. But there have been questions about, the session types. Like this. We have the speed talks, the creative wellbeing practices. Are we going to be doing yoga and Pilates there? We're interested to hear. Anyway, we'll come back to you for more on the conference. But let me go to Daniel, who I have mistakenly called David a couple of times. But Daniel, you first. Could you have a go at some of those big questions and any other thing that you want to add to the excellent presentation? Please.
Yeah, absolutely. Excellent questions and really fantastic discussion points from Laura and Thomas. And I think, talking about plurality of preference, knowledge co-production, these are very salient terms to me that sort of jumped out, and I think fit with what I was sort of talking about, with that kind of cultural evolutionary perspective, that these are things that develop over time through diversity, through multiple viewpoints, allowing things to sort of co-produce as they go, responsive, hitting the principles that we all sort of share, but then responsive to individual contexts and preferences. I think that's very critical. Your question, Chuks, were great. You talk about elite competition. This is one of the sort of cornerstones of our work historically, and in our research into contemporary societies, as well as the influence, and often corrosive influence, of those with sort of wealth and power, how those kinds of structural inequalities, as I was talking about, build up and not just sort of depress well-being overall, but lead to unrest among those power holders as they're vying for a kind of limited number of positions. This historically we've seen time and time and time again. This leads to the kind of polarization, violent, sort of frustrated, atypical kind of actions, increasingly sort of fundamentalist sort of policies as you're trying to gain a foothold. We're seeing this around the world today. This is, again, gonna not be sort of surprising to anyone here. What do you do to unwind it? How do you sort of, if they're part of the problem, how do you get them out of the way and make them part of the solution? This, to me, is one of the key questions that we all need to grapple with, because you're seeing this in societies around the world. Generally what we see historically, again, is either those with wealth, and especially those with sort of political and social power, can help and start this process and sort of support some of these policies that maybe limit some of their own wealth and power, but overall, work to more quickly, more sustainably change the structures. Or they get in the way, and that tends to lead to violence. And again, we see this all the time. Historically, these are periods that spiral into violent confrontation, civil wars. Sometimes at the end of it, you can have some improvements, but it's often very terrible while it's happening. And there's no guarantee, even at the end of it, it's going to be better. People are going to be better off than they were before. So it's not a great situation to be in. What we find is that I think taking the widening your temporal scope really helps here. And a lot of, those, again, with wealth and power, these sort of so-called elites, feel like they're doing well now. They're at the top. They want to hold on. They have these sort of incentives to preserve the status quo, even violently. That's extremely short-sighted. These kind of policies, these practices, are not only corrosive for those in sort of the lower strata of socioeconomically, but for themselves as well, for the elite class, also suffer in the long term from these policies. So they are doing a disservice to their own interests, and that feels that sort of conversations, those exposing those need to be made. And again, in rare instances, historically, we have seen those with power get on board with progressive transformations, and that speeds it up. Those tend to be a little more long-lasting and sustainable when that happens. So I think that really needs to be a key goal that we have, bringing everyone into this mission, not an us versus them kind of mentality, because that tends not to work that well, and leads to a lot of violence along the way. That's kind of, I don't have the silver bullet for that. I wish I did, but I do think that's an absolutely critical point that we need to address and not shy away from, and not pretend that there aren't asymmetries in wealth and power, because that doesn't serve our interests either. When you're talking about co-production of knowledge, it needs to be everybody, and take account of what the system actually is now, so that we can do the unlearning, so that we can get past the lock-ins, which I think, Laura, that's an excellent way of putting it. We need to be clear about what they are and where they came from in order to be different. So that was a little bit of a longer answer, but there is a lot there that I think we can talk about. Your other question was on sort of inequality, and should we, is that kind of getting in the way? Is that its own derailment risk, is focusing on, say, social or economic inequality when we need to deal with the climate? I would say that's kind of missing the point of Polycrisis. Like, these are not separable. And I think this is one of the real ways we get ourselves in trouble. And, Chuks, you talked about, how difficult it is. And Laura, you mentioned just the language of, are you allowed to say things like Polycrisis? Is that too alarmist? Is that too overwhelming for governments who want to focus on, one campaign issue at a time? Really is missing the point of the Polycrisis, which is trying to expose that these are not separable issues, right? One of the things I've been saying is that, if inequality not only suppresses well-being, but erodes social cohesion, and we need that social cohesion to do all the interventions that we need to mitigate climate risks, then inequality is a climate issue, right? So, a major international company getting in the way of union organization, that's a climate issue, right? That's a climate affront. And it doesn't sound like it. You say, oh, no, that's just economic. No, that's a climate policy, full stop, very, very directly. And so I think trying to carve these out in their sort of traditional domains and keeping them separate really gets in the way of coming up with interventions. And so that's I would strongly rail against that kind of perspective. But it's interesting to bring up. But I do think it is, it is common, so it's important to get at.
You will not get a stronger agreement from anybody than me on that. Thank you very much for bringing us so powerfully well. Laura, over to you. If inequality is a big problem, should we go for a global degrowth system? And what kind of language can we use to promote alarmist versus positive? What kind of values, global values, should we be pursuing?
I think, that language question, just to start with that, because it builds on what Daniel was saying, is I think we need both. I don't think it's an either or, right? We need to say it's really bad right now. It's going to be getting worse if we continue like this. But there is always scope to change, right? We can actually reorient ourselves. There can be transformations. We've seen historically how transformations have happened, so that, we've got precedent for how we could do things differently, and we need to be able to imagine what those look like. So, I spend a lot of my time, as you know, working on what these preferable or aspirational futures could look like. And it's not to discount the fact that, we also need to know how bad it could get. But unless we actually have a sense of where we want to orient to, or to have those hard conversations about, well, in order for us to get to this point that we all can buy into, we've met the SDGs, we've met the Paris Agreement, we've met the Global Biodiversity Framework. But in order to do that, some had to lose and some had to win more, right? And what do those decisions look like? What are those pathways? Because if we can start to agree on that endpoint, maybe we can start to unpack the only ways of getting there. And I think that talks to these different economic paradigms, right? So, Daniel was talking a lot to the governance, to the power aspects, and obviously the economy is a fundamental aspect of that. I'm no economist, but I think for me, again, coming back to language, I prefer thinking about post-growth. So this idea of we've been so obsessed with this idea of growth and we need to move on to something else. And that I think in some instances, 100% means degrowth in some areas. In others, it's like just transcending this idea of things need to get bigger and bigger and bigger, right? So there's this question or this conversation that we've had about what is sufficient, right? This idea of, sufficiency. When we're looking at a planet, equity, not just intragenerational or intergenerational, but we've also started to talk about interspecies justice aspects, what is sufficient? I think that's the value-based questions we need to be asking ourselves right now. When you're looking at economic or business models like the iPhone built-in obsolescence, right? Just the mere thought that is actually just something that can be seen to be a profitable, financially sustainable model is bizarre, right? It goes against all logical thinking, and yet it's the reality that we have. So even just starting to unpack some of those mental models that we take for granted. This might also be something that the other panelists want to unpack. We've been thinking through alternative economic models, but just the notion of the nation state too, and the idea of a passport that, 200 years ago wouldn't have been a thing, visas to get between countries, the way we've delineated them now, this is a pretty new in human history invention that we've become, again, locked into, that reinforces particular power dynamics, who has access, whose trade regulations are applying to whom, which bodies are able to move in places that others aren't. So I think thinking through transformative futures also forces us to unpack all of these things that we take for granted and reconfigure them. And I think that's where some of this transformative capacity really needs to get built in. So that hopefully answers both your degrowth and your language question. And I think that this is also asking us to do academia in different ways. And I think that that's something that Thomas is also alluding to in the different structures of the conversations that we want to have at the workshop is, are these more sort of less academically structured, but conversations or dialogues or labs, T-labs, where we can bring different perspectives together and start to unpack and grapple with some of these questions in place, rather than just saying, this is my work, and have people engage with it almost in a singular way, which also has its value. You know, it's about getting multiple things right. Speed talks a little bit like what we've been doing here, right? It's like, here, 5 minutes thoughts, 5 minutes. Okay, now let's have a conversation and sort of like see how we're solving all the problems based on that. You know, so to also give the opportunity for more people to be able to participate. I think it's also a really important skill set for our early career researchers, and that's going to be a big focus of the conference, just to make sure that we have a lot of early career researchers who have access. Hopefully, especially from the continent, trying to sort of leverage our Future Earth Africa hub to be able to make sure that we do, you know, make it an African conference on the African continent with our international guests coming to us. You know, and that's going to take some work, but I think, you know, it would really just encourage everyone, please, to reach out to your networks and to ask us if you have any questions. And we're going to try and make it as inclusive from that perspective as possible. So that's also just to say an important component of the work. And we're looking to do a winter school the week before for a bunch of early career researchers to come through. So that's in the pipeline. I can't believe it's already halfway through October, but we'll be getting there. It's all good, breathing.
And Laura, I think we're still open for co-sponsorship. Is that correct?
Yes, 100%. Yep.
Okay. So guys, you know what to do. Jonathan is going to come back and thank all our co-sponsors for this event. But hey, if one wants to know how they can be co-sponsor, who should they go? Jonathan, will I be you?
I guess you could contact the International Project Office. We'll be putting up the stay in touch details towards the end of the session.
Good. So Laura, you always know how to put these things beautifully well. You know, I think that I share with you post-growth, and I've also heard the concept of our growth, which is let it grow where it's necessary, but degrow where it's also necessary. But also the concept of sufficiency, redefining what is well-being, but also temperance, as Thomas was saying. So it almost seems like what we have is a spiritual problem, if you like. The Polycrisis is a spiritual problem that invites us to dig deeper into issues of sufficiency, how we define temperance, how we define collaboration, how we'll, and I think Thomas was talking about this inner transformation, which I think is about starting with a sense of well-being. How do we substitute greed for temperance? So it looks like the values, we need a new global value system, if you like, to guide us. Deeper collaboration, deeper cooperation, less competitiveness, deliberation, etc. Do we have Blake, Jonathan, any questions on the Q&A? I can't see it. Let me see. Oh, I can't. I see two. No questions. All right. Any questions? Anybody wishing to jump in with a raised hand? Has Laura changed? Oh, no, she hasn't. She just put off her coat. Okay. Right. Okay. So I think we have time for one more. It's an open question. Anybody can answer it. Are there examples that inspire hope at a local, national, or global space that is kind of very specific issue, maybe COVID, or are there any examples that inspire hope or paint a clear picture of how we can achieve transformation? And by the way, just agreeing with Laura, most African governments I talk to, they prefer transformation to transition. It's also something that anybody can talk about, you know, transformation. What's the difference? But anyway, are there examples at a very local or even personal level, you know, that can inspire hope? Anybody?
I mean, we've got an entire project on this called Seeds of Good Anthropocenes. And I think a lot of good things are happening at the local level. And I think we quite often discount good things happening at local level in small places because they're not scaling, right? They're not changing the whole system. But I think maybe we need to reevaluate what we mean by impact sometimes, that actually improve livelihoods, well-being for a small group of people in a particular place is a win. And just because it's not going to scale or solve sort of the hunger problem for 2 billion doesn't mean to say that it's not good. And I think this almost obsession with scale, with getting bigger, with having this kind of global impact has led us to this problem in the first instance, right? Multinational corporations owning things, being able to move things around. So I think in just going back and finding in your local community even the soup kitchen that works well, or the access to a community gardening service, which is also providing food and shelter and green space for, just those things. And I think that if we can focus on finding those and doing more of that kind of work, I think eventually we would start to get this patchwork of change and be able to sort of provide those alternatives to the dominant system that's constraining us at the moment. And I think that that's really where the tension starts to come in is, again, we're locked in to making particular choices because society, our economies, our societies have been structured along this. And that revaluing that you were mentioning, Chuks, I think comes down to going to place, to finding things, those connections that we have with people, with places, with other species. Yeah, so they're definitely out there.
Yeah.
And then you're a historian before you became a complex science. Does history offer us any specific example, Daniel?
Well, yeah. So I mean, this is a really fantastic point. Thanks, Laura. Your phrase of the obsession with scale, I think that's exactly right and well put. And not that scale isn't important. We need to scale up, but it's not. We don't need to do it right away, right? Scale doesn't just come immediately. As you say, what we've seen is, the way we got into this mess is from a bunch of little things and local decisions and ideas over time end up scaling up. And the reverse is also true, right? Our solutions can scale kind of organically-ish from these like the local community, the local soup kitchen. One example, I was just in Mexico City a couple of years ago, and they have done a lot in certain areas with their air pollution with a very simple thing that they just don't allow certain cars on certain streets on certain days. They're just reducing their car, like it was just an easy thing. Hey, don't drive now. And it made a significant impact. Tiny little thing, all cities can do it, kind of easy to implement and enforce. Those kinds of local solutions, yeah, it's not global, it's not gonna solve the climate crisis and sort of carbon overshoot overnight, but those things can add up and end up scaling and change the sort of culture and the idea of, am I trying to drive all the time? Am I going to rethink when I'm doing this? These sort of just more social psychological changes in individuals, which can then make it easier to do the next change. And so I think there is a dynamic here. Chuks, really, really quickly, you do mention historically, this is really the whole cornerstone of my research is trying to find good examples from the past. Unfortunately, almost all of them are kind of negative, scary examples that we want to avoid. There are a few moments, maybe not perfectly translatable to our circumstance, but at least reveal some of the principles and the ideas. And again, it is, getting whole societies on board with these kinds of social transformations, getting those in power to kind of see that there are crises being faced, that there is unrest, that there is injustice, and being willing to start to do something about it. I mentioned the progressive era in the US, early 1900s, a series of reforms, including led by some of like the most wealthiest industrial sort of robber baron types, the Carnegies, the Vanderbilts, the Fords, for kind of selfish reasons, realized that sort of their workers were upset. There was a lot of violence going on. There was a lot of labor strife. And they said, well, this isn't working for us. Maybe we should actually kind of take some of their complaints seriously. a lot of what we now kind of take for granted, at least in the West, of labor reform, labor control, safety regulations, workplace regulations, wage regulations, these were put into place during this period, during these kind of progressive eras. This sort of idea of providing for well-being, allowing for a little more of a redistributive kind of economy, didn't solve all the problems, but it helped. It started the ball rolling. Then again, you know, in sort of the 30s with the New Deal era, for my analysis, that was only kind of possible and acceptable because it was already building on things that were already there. There was enough support for it from the kind of first round in the early 1900s to do it again in the 1930s, then to do it again in the 1950s. So it was again, you know, and I think this comes, Laura, again, to your point of scale. It's not going to be all at once. Like, we got to start the ball rolling, and that, you know, each win that we get helps with the next win. And so we don't need it all at once. This isn't an all or nothing kind of situation. Start small, start local, start immediate, and let that spiral. But then we gotta keep the train rolling. Is the only kind of issue there, and that's really what history tells us. The successes were not overnight. These are decades to get from point A to a better point B.
Thank you. We're coming to the end of this interesting and fascinating session. Tom, do you have any last point to make? It can be organizational, it can be about 2025, it can be intellectual.
Yeah, just addressing Daniel's point, yeah, and also Laura's point on scaling. It's not about scaling up, it's also about scaling deep. And especially from a community building context, it's we often see it's not working to scale communities. So like, okay, now we have 100 people, now we need 1,000. So the whole metric system doesn't really work, especially when there is funding in there, and it's the project is structured after certain KPIs that doesn't serve the purpose anymore often. So that's something I wanted to say on scaling. And another one on the well-being practices, Chuks, that you mentioned. There was this quote of Gus Spath that said, "I used to think that global environmental problems were biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse, and climate change. And but he said, the top environmental problems are selfishness, greed, apathy, and to deal with these, we need a spiritual and cultural transformation." And I think that's where the well-being practices start. So we will have in next year's conference also well-being practices, art and creative sessions. That means maybe a theater or movie screenings, exhibitions that trigger our awareness in a different way and shifts our consciousness in a way that we look through different lenses at these topics. Organizational on the conference, I just want to share that, as I said, like the call for proposals is open. The link can be put in the chat. Ideally, get in touch with the International Project Office for partnerships and sponsorships. We're welcoming all kinds of contributions, either with an academic background or practitioner background. We're really excited to host the first time on the African continent. So it's really about strengthening the South-South relationships, and we coming as a guest from all over the world, as Laura put it so nicely. Yeah, with that in mind, I hope to see you next year at the conference. And yeah, back to you, Chuks, and thank you for having me.
Thank you very much. We had one question from the audience about value. One of the strengths of Daniel's way of thinking about it is that he approaches Polycrisis from the social, cultural, and value perspective. But if the way our ability to respond to or fail to respond to Polycrisis is down to the sort of the values that shape a society. One question from Bob is, how has values evolved over time? Are we getting more competitive in nature? What kind of, are we just replacing one sort of elite-based value for order? Are things getting worse? Daniel, 30 seconds.
You know, really quick, I tried to type a little response. A great question, Bob. You know, to me, there's no single direction that we see historically in any sort of dimension, and values is certainly not one of them. We see shifts, sometimes very slow, sometimes very fast, often shifts for the worse, sometimes shifts for the better, often in response to some sort of crisis or catastrophic thing. But we do find periods of value seeming to change, people coming together to solve a problem. COVID is a good example. In some places, there was a lot of coming together, let's shift our values, let's make sure we're taking care of each other, and put policies into place to sort of allow those values to persist. They don't last forever, right? You need to, again, keep reinforcing, re-implementing them. But there is, our social systems are much more malleable than we sometimes think. And I think the historical perspective, Laura, you mentioned this as well, moving away from our lock-ins, realizing the historical perspective can help, right? The nation state has not always been there. People have gotten along without it, therefore we can again. Like these kinds of points, I think, are really important to remember, that what we have now doesn't need to be and hasn't always been.
Thank you. I'm afraid that's all we have time for. The issue of the nation state was actually a major topic in the opening plenary. Jonathan might pick up on that. Susan Park made a very powerful set of powerful points around the incongruence, if you like, between the architecture and the motif of the nation state and polycrisis and the cascading environmental problems. And why it's difficult under the current circumstances and structure to address those. But thank you very much, Thomas Haselböck. Thank you, Daniel Hoyer. Thank you, Laura Pereira. We've seen that we really need to think about how we can imagine governance in the era of polycrisis. And it seems there are several tensions that we need to navigate. Tension between authoritarian governance, just stop driving your car, versus more deliberative governance. Come, let's talk about it. Tension between a positive presentation versus tell it as it is. Tension between pragmatism versus realism. Tension between nation state and maybe indigenous or entrepreneurial approaches. Tension between local scale and global scale. Tension between development focus and equity and well-being focused. So we have a lot of research that we can be doing in this space. And we're looking forward to South Africa 2025 to deepen our conversation on these very interesting and topical questions. With that, I hand over back to Jonathan Pickering to bring us to the final part of the closing session. Thank you very much, panelists. It's been a pleasure. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, Chuks, and thank you for me to our wonderful panelists. It was a great discussion and give us a huge amount to think about. And I'd like to just pick up on a couple of points about polycrisis and sort of the theme of the forum overall and what they might mean for the ESG community as we go forward. So I'll say a little bit about that, and then I'll have a number of thanks to say. So I really just wanted to make 2 points sort of about the relevance of this polycrisis idea for the ESG community. One is a point about critique, and the other one is about connection. And first on critique, this sort of brings me back to a point that Susan Park made in her opening plenary, where she commented that we could see, say, terms like polycrisis and the Anthropocene as comparable to the extent that they kind of both aim to capture some kind of overarching perspective of the age we live in. And of course, in recent years, we've seen some pretty robust debates inside and outside the ESG community about, say, the idea of the Anthropocene. You know, what aspects does this framing emphasize? What aspects does it conceal? How does this framing, say, challenge or reinforce dominant power relations? Similarly, we've sort of seen debates in the ESG community about use of emergency or crisis framings in the context of climate change and biodiversity loss. And of course, we can ask many of the same questions about polycrisis, right? And as Laura illustrated so vividly, clearly some people have some sensitivities about the term. And if the debates we've seen in the ESG community are anything to go by, it may be that terms such as polycrisis can serve productively as both an arena for debate and critique about the nature of the era that we live in, but also as a foundation for research and collaboration. And that sort of brings me to the second point, which is about connection. And I'd imagine that, say, for many of us in the ESG network, even if we don't explicitly use the term polycrisis in our research, the term still might speak or connect in some way to many of the issues we might be concerned about. Let's say if it's about globally networked risks, complex systems, regime interactions, and so on, or may connect to work that many of us are doing at the intersection of environmental governance and other issues with other aspects of the polycrisis, things like conflict, food security, supply chains, health, poverty, and, of course, very importantly, inequality. So I guess that idea that environmental crises feed into other crises and are fed by them as well is also important for putting the work that we do in perspective. So on one hand, it's sort of grounds for humility in our work, in the sense that it requires us to acknowledge that, well, environmental concerns are not the only issues that people are grappling with, right? And as Daniel said, focusing on one crisis alone is missing the point here. But on the other hand, this is also a call to action and collaboration, because it's clear that if we're going to make headway on other crises, we need to confront environmental crises, and vice versa. So it's vital that system governance scholars connect with researchers and practitioners working in and across related fields. So the panel today was a great illustration of the kinds of productive exchanges we can find from bringing people together from different fields. And I'll say a little bit more about the conference in a moment, but just to connect it to one other aspect of our work, some of you would have joined the Nijmegen agenda launch earlier this week, which we're really pleased to have released. The Nijmegen agenda on transformative and interdisciplinarity and transdisciplinarity in Earth system governance research and engagement. And of course, this underscores the vital importance of working across disciplinary boundaries with a broader range of actors in society to catalyse sustainability transformations. And of course, many of you are also doing this sort of work already, but I think the agenda is a real vital stimulus to take this work forward and ramp it up. So if you haven't already done so, really encourage you to have a look at the agenda. And I think it will be important for us as a community to reflect and think about how we can take this agenda forward. So there are just a few thoughts on polycrisis, and so a few things emerging from the forum. But I'd now like to sort of conclude with a few votes of thanks, and there are quite a few, so shove yourself in a little bit. But I'm really keen to just express my appreciation and the community's appreciation for the wide range of people who have made this forum possible. And I'd like to begin with the Forum Committee. So, Chuks and Kyla, Anashri, and DG, who've done a fantastic job in coming up with a creative and practical design for the forum and have shepherded it expertly from this initial idea to its fulfillment here. And thanks also to our fellow members of the SSC. So the Forum Committee are all members of the Scientific Steering Committee, and our broader committee, you can see here, have provided input at various stages. And particular thanks to Kyla, who is co-chair earlier this year, and Christina, who has joined as fellow co-chair. Now, as you'd be aware the forum was designed a little differently this year and was, I would say, certainly differently to our regular conferences, and was really designed to harness the energy of the range of groups in the community that are so important to help the network flourish. These include the research centres, the task forces, working groups, as well as the South-South Initiative and the Early Career Committee. And all of these groups did a really wonderful job of designing the individual sessions, bringing speakers together, running the sessions, mobilising their colleagues, and often in quite creative ways. Particularly enjoyed a session on Monday during the Australia Research Centre where we had a role-playing session with the Council of the Living River. This is designed by Stephanie Rosestone from Australian National University. So big thanks to all these groups. Many of you are probably involved in one or more of them already. And if you're new to the network, really encourage you as well to join one of these groups. And given that many of the issues that these groups deal with are interconnected, sort of in the spirit of the forum, we're also really keen to sort of foster further connections across working groups and task forces. Next, I'd like to thank all of our co-hosts for the generous and vital financial support that they've provided to enable the forum to go ahead. So Canada Research Chairs, IDOS, German Institute for Development and Sustainability, Utrecht University, Future Earth, Sydney Environment Institute at the University of Sydney, and the University of Bath. So many thanks indeed. We're particularly grateful as well to Utrecht University and the Copernicus Institute for their funding of the International Project Office for the past 5+ years. And this funding has been absolutely crucial in underpinning the network's operations. It's enabled us to diversify, to expand and flourish in those years. And while we're now coming towards the end of this funding partnership, and we hope soon to release an update about our new IPO host, we have no doubt that these strong ties between Utrecht University and the network will continue. Huge thanks to our volunteers. We had a very dedicated and energetic team of volunteers who did amazing work behind the scenes to ensure that the online and hybrid sessions kept running. Thanks also to We and Goliath, the organisation that created and facilitated the online platform. And We and Goliath has, as part of their commitment to solutions to the climate crisis, offered to host the forum website indefinitely at no cost to the project. So much appreciated. Now, I'd also like to thank, this is going like a little back in time, but this is because we, of course, the forum idea developed late last year, and this was at a time when we had previous staff of the International Project Office, Jane Butler, Camille Thébault, and Vera de Jong, who did a lot in the early stages of the forum planning to get things going. And as many of you may know, Trio finished up those roles early this year. We had a lovely farewell for them then, but I wanted to acknowledge that support for the early stages of the forum. And of course, we're really pleased that Camille Thébault has returned as Director of the Earth System Governance Foundation. We'll hear more from her about that role very soon. I'd like to now come to a very special and important word of thanks. This is to our IPO, our current IPO, and in particular, our network coordinator, Blake Harvey. So Blake joined us in this role earlier this year. She had previously coordinated the SDGs task force and worked on the Global Goals project. So she was no stranger to the network. And Blake has done an utterly amazing job this year. So not only on organising the forum, but right across all the work she has been doing to keep the network going. So it's been a big ask going from an office of 3 to an office of 1, of course, with the help of some interns, including Jay, who's just recently joined from the University of Bath. But Blake has led the office with incredible energy, practicality, and creative thinking, and we've been just so fortunate to have her work with us. Now, the sad thing is that we'll soon part ways with Blake on the IPO as she starts on her PhD, but of course I trust like you'll stay involved in the project in one way or another, and of course we wish you all the best with your studies. Now, I did ask Blake to say a few words, but unfortunately, she declined because she has just come down with COVID, which we're sorry to hear, Blake, and we hope you are feeling a lot better soon. This is, yes, well, unfortunately, yes, that you hope you get through this particular polycrisis very soon. It's been a big job getting this forum going, and I've only just had a little bit of an insight into the technical complexity of doing all these online sessions. So thank you so much. And in a final word of thanks to the whole ESG community, to everyone who's here at the plenary today, and everyone who's been involved with the forum, just for the enthusiasm and the ideas you brought to the event. Now, looking forward, there are just a couple of things I will just very briefly mention. Well, actually, looking back for a moment, if you reflect a little on some of the great things that have been happening in the community, our annual report from last year came out recently. And looking ahead, well, we've already heard quite a bit about our next conference, jointly with the transformations community, which I'm also very excited about. And thanks, Laura and Thomas, for telling us a bit about how the conference will work. We're also very, very excited about doing things differently as well. So I think there's been some great ideas have gone into designing the sessions and making them as inclusive and productive as possible. And so we hope to see as many of you as possible in South Africa in August next year. But it will there will be hybrid. There's a hybrid element to the conference as well. So this means that you'll be having an opportunity to involve no matter where you happen to be. So please think about putting in a submission either for a regular paper or for any of the wide range of sessions that will be offered at the conference. So that was really all I had to say for now. So unless anyone, the Chuks on the panel would like to say anything, we might consider the forum closed. Chuks?
No.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Nothing to say. I just want to
No.
thank all the people that co-organized this ESG 24 forum with me. They did incredibly great amount of work. Thank you so much to Kyla, Danashri, and DG. Thank you, Jonathan, for steering us, and Christina as well. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Guys, thank you so much. All the best. And please stay in touch.
See you in South Africa next year. Bye-bye.
Okay.
Is the case.